Just one generation ago, we lived in a world where Americans believed that regardless of the turmoils of the world, we were safe at home. Today, most of us look at the events that occurred on September 11, 2001 as the turning point in the level of security we encounter at airports and many buildings. Another turning point, however, is the focus of this lecture. Many consider the 1993 Jack-in-the-Box E. coli outbreak to be the 9/11 of the food industry.
An examination of this event shows how change can be found at every step of the way from the farm to the fork: economic, geographical, social, and political.
20 years ago, when one family first heard reports of a food illness outbreak in the Seattle, Washington area, the news included reference to a little-known bacteria called E. coli 0157H7. The family soon found out that investigators connected the illness to hamburger sold at Jack-in-the-Box restaurants. So, they thought, all they needed to do was avoid eating hamburgers, avoid eating at that fast food chain, or quite honestly just avoid eating at any Seattle area restaurant. They also thought that their son Riley was safe too, as, at only 16 months of age, he was too young to eat hamburger. This was January of 1993, and like most Americans at the time, the family in this story was hearing the word E. coli for the first time. Back before the Jack-in-the-Box E. coli outbreak, the CDC did not recognize E. coli as a reportable disease. Thus, doctors were not required to report cases to health authorities. Even though the center of the outbreak was some 90 miles south of where they lived, Riley's father was alarmed when he arrived at his son's daycare center to find a notice from the county health department. Officials wanted parents to watch for signs of illness in their children. Health officials were concerned about a sick 18-month-old boy at the daycare center. The sick boy's father was a shift supervisor at a Jack-in-the-Box restaurant in town. His mother, an assistant manager at that same restaurant, cooked a hamburger for herself and for her child. That night, as she and her son became ill, the mother suspected that they had E. coli. She took him immediately to the hospital for testing, which, at the time, required 48 hours for results. The next morning, on her way to work, she dropped the child off at the daycare center, but did not tell the staff about his illness for fear that they would send the child home. It wasn't until the following day, after she again dropped him off at the daycare center and went to work to cook hamburgers, before the daycare staff noticed that the boy had diarrhea.
At the time of the 1993 outbreak, inspectors from the USDA's Food Safety Inspection Service would approve or reject meat as each carcass passed by them at the slaughterhouse. This accepted procedure of poke and sniff had been in place since the passage of the 1906 Federal Meat Inspection Act.
The boy was left in the daycare center, interacting with many children, for 2 days before the lab returned test results. Results which indicated positive for E. coli 0157H7, the same exact strain that was implicated in the Jack-in-the-Box E. coli outbreak. Health officials, after being contacted by the hospital, were alarmed to find that they couldn't reach these parents in the middle of the workday. What they found was that the parents went back to work, cooking hamburgers at Jack-in-the-Box. Worse, they had left their child in the daycare center this entire time. Officials feared he could have infected other children by direct person-to-person contact or by contaminating surfaces or objects with the bacteria. To the average American consumer, it was scary enough to learn that you could get sick from something that you could eat in food. It was even scarier to find out that you could get it through person-to-person contact. E. coli is found in the intestines of many animals, including humans. But E. coli 0157H7 is a specific strain, one of many, which causes disease outbreaks among humans. In beef cattle, the meat sits between the intestines and the hide. With shrinking lands for grazing and an industry trend towards smaller and more factory-like conditions in feedlot pens, chances for cross-contamination of pathogens onto the meat has become more frequent. That night, this family's worst fears came true as Riley began showing symptoms. Early the next morning, they rushed their son to the hospital for testing. According to health officials, Riley was now one of 623 patients sickened by this E. coli outbreak across Washington, Oregon, Nevada, and California. Investigations later revealed that Jack in the Box had large batches of frozen, pre-formed beef patties delivered from their distributor in Southern California up and along the I-5 freeway, part of Eisenhower's Interstate Highway Act, to franchises in California, Oregon, Washington, and Nevada, exactly where the reported illnesses took place. After spending a few days at a small hospital, Riley was airlifted to Children's Hospital in Seattle, where doctors performed exploratory surgery and were forced to remove a large portion of his intestines, which were destroyed. They then placed him in a medically induced coma. His little boy body was dwarfed by all the wires and tubes and all the monitoring equipment that was on and around his hospital bed.
It all began in January when the first of what would be more than 400 people reported that they had become sick after eating contaminated beef.
7 new cases of E. coli poisoning were confirmed.
E. coli patients remain hospitalized at this hour.
The infection claimed its first life.
The flurry of news coverage led to brief national attention to the E. coli problem. But soon, the story began to fade. Many in the media and in the government treated E. coli as a local problem, not of concern to the rest of the country. Several reporters, as well as executives from meat and restaurant industries, and even government officials announced that the outbreak was over, as the number of people sick from eating the source decreased. Riley's parents knew otherwise. Cases of children sickened from secondary or person-to-person infections grew rapidly. Doctors predicted that a second wave of patients, mostly children, could outnumber those who actually ate the tainted meat. The biggest issue in the spread of this bacteria was as a result of the fast food chain's policy to cook their meat to an internal temperature of 140 degrees, too low to kill the bacteria. According to Bert Bartelson, Washington State Department of Health investigator of the outbreak, had Jack in the Box followed state regulations, which mandated that hamburgers be cooked to an internal temperature of 155 degrees, the epidemic would have been prevented. No one would have gotten sick. For weeks, Riley's condition worsened. He suffered from Hemolytic-uremic syndrome, a kidney disease associated with the most severe of E. coli cases. E. coli 0157H7 is just one of many other foodborne pathogens such as Salmonella, Listeria, and Campylobacter, which cause illness and, in some cases, death. The CDC estimates that each year, roughly 1 in 6 Americans, or 48 million people, get sick. 128,000 are hospitalized, and 3,000 die of foodborne diseases. On February 20, 1993, Riley died from respiratory failure brought on by the E. coli infection. He had never eaten a hamburger in his life. The news coverage of this 1993 outbreak, as well as the deaths of young children from a food which we had long considered a safe American tradition, pushed foodborne illness onto the national stage as a real and present danger. This event sparked changes in the way consumers and the government view food safety. 3 landmark changes include government labeling of food industry product and government regulation in terms of what is contained in products and in terms of quality inspection standards.
In 1994, spurred by the national shock over the Jack in the Box E. coli outbreak, the USDA developed and began to implement their pathogen reduction program.
The first phase of this program involved a consumer awareness campaign described as a bold action to educate the general public. Agriculture Secretary Mike Espy proclaimed that, in the absence of a way to detect or prevent the presence of the bacteria, the USDA must do everything they can do to help inform consumers about proper preparation and storage of not ready-to-eat meat and poultry. This program included food safe handling labels affixed to packages of raw meat and poultry. According to the Pathogen Reduction Program's description of consumer awareness in the Federal Register, the Food Safety Inspection Service will, quote-unquote, inform consumers of the risks associated with unsafe food handling. For the last 2 decades, all packages of raw or not ready-to-eat meat and poultry sold in the United States have been required by the United States Department of Agriculture to display these instructions. They have served as the most visible device the USDA has employed to educate consumers about food safety.
In October of 1994, the USDA added the most significant portion of their pathogen reduction program.
Mike Taylor, the USDA's new administrator for the Food Safety Inspection Service, or FSIS, stood before the American Meat Institute at their annual convention and declared that the USDA will now consider raw ground beef that is contaminated with E. coli 0157H7 to be adulterated within the meaning of the 1906 Federal Meat Inspection Act. This was an unprecedented act. The government adopted a zero-tolerance policy for fecal contamination in beef by declaring E. coli 0157H7 an illegal adulterant in ground beef. As a result, the many participants along the supply chain from farm to retail, not just meat packers, would now be required to take additional actions, including testing. Another significant change in the food industry has been the mandatory implementation of HACCP, or Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points. This is a science-based risk management system. The principle of HACCP is to identify steps in food processing where contamination is likely to occur and take measures to address those risks.
These policy changes did not come without objection or cost.
The meat and poultry industry vigorously objected to the proposed labeling requirements, arguing that the time allowed for compliance was too short and that compliance would be too costly. Tyson Foods, the world's largest beef processor, sent a letter to the USDA declaring that the changes in labeling would cost their company $9 million.
After these efforts did not delay the ruling on the labels, the American Meat Institute, the National Broiler Council, and Tyson Foods lobbied a U.S. senator to send a letter drafted by Tyson Foods to Vice President Al Gore requesting that he review this labeling matter.
In the letter, Tyson Foods argued that to meet the label deadline on all products would cost them about $30 million and ultimately end up costing the industry as a whole several $100 million.
Initially, the rule was to take effect in mid-October 1993 for raw, partially cooked, or ground meat and poultry. All other poultry and meat products would be required to have safe handling labels by mid-January of 1994. However, a group of food industry trade associations filed a lawsuit and won their motion for an injunction to block the USDA from enforcing the label implementation deadline. As a result of the injunction, the USDA rule was delayed until May of 1994, which was the deadline initially requested by the industry. Beyond the cost to implement the food safe handling labels, the food industry also expressed concerns over consumers' reactions to the labels. According to an American Meat Institute spokesperson, warning labels really frighten the public. If consumers follow safe handling procedures, there's no need to scare people about what is really a very wholesome and nutritious product.
This description of the clean product may be very easy for the general public to believe, but what if the product is contaminated? In a 1990 fact bulletin, the USDA described contaminated meat and poultry as causing thousands of illnesses, hundreds of outbreaks, and several deaths every single year. In fact, they went on to claim that somewhere between 6.5 and 8.1 million people may actually suffer from foodborne illness symptoms each and every year.
The agriculture department's work to protect the consumer is often thwarted by efforts from the industry and by the fact that the USDA has dual responsibilities, not only to regulate the quality of meat, but also to promote its sale and use.
Pressures associated with the labels and with public awareness in general from within the industry were of significant concern to the USDA, who agrees with the fears shared by large numbers of industry groups, that by giving the consumer too much information, the consumer may not only be motivated to stop old behaviors associated with food products, but, worse, be motivated to discontinue purchasing them. The food safe handling labels and the pathogen reduction program came about after almost a century of food industry changes and the shift in consumer demand after the 1993 Jack-in-the-Box E.coli outbreak. These two are the most significant changes in federal food safety regulatory policy since the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act and the Federal Meat Inspection Act, which the government passed in response to industry and consumer demand changes after Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle. May of 2014 marks the 20th anniversary of the food safe handling labels. Unfortunately, Riley, who would have been 23 years old on that anniversary, was not the last person to become sick or to die as a result of foodborne pathogens.